Welcome back, and thank you for coming back after what was a monster of a lecture for number 20. This is number 21, and even though we're covering two historical topics, 3.11 and 3.12, it's not going to be nearly as long as what you just had to deal with. So today we are dealing with developing an American identity and then movement in the early republic. Two themes that we're looking at, American and regional culture and migration and settlement. So let's begin with culture here with this learning objective. Explain the continuities and changes in American culture from 1754 to 1800. The key concept says new forms of national culture developed in the United States alongside continued regional variations. So the national culture is going to be this new egalitarian society. That means that they believe that people are equal. This is furthered in the Constitution with the abolition of aristocratic titles. They are more religiously tolerant. We have separation of church and state written into the Bill of Rights. Most states have the separation of church and state. Only some states are going to continue to have these established churches. So this is where we're going to see the regional variations. In New England, you're still going to see established churches. In the South, they're going to continue to practice slavery as it's being phased out in the North. And then the political parties also add another element here to the regional variation, with Federalists generally being in the North, where there is more manufacturing, and so therefore they would benefit from Federalist policies. Meanwhile, the Democratic Republicans are in the South. They oppose the Federalist policies for greater tariffs and excise taxes, and they have more agriculture. Meanwhile, the Federalists believe that the future of the country was going to be in manufacturing. Now, for arts, literature, and architecture, ideas about national identity were increasingly found in expressions in works of art, literature, and architecture. So art is the big one. We see American art coming to fruition here with the artists like John Trumbull, Charles Willson Peale, Gilbert Stuart, John Singleton Copley, and all of these artists are really basing their subject matter in scenes of the Revolution, scenes in the early Republic. So in the top right here, you have Washington resigning his commission at the end of the Revolutionary War. That is painted by John Trumbull. You have the famous portrait artist, Charles Willson Peale, here on the left. Then Gilbert Stuart, who was also a portrait artist, he made this portrait of George Washington that is in the National Portrait Gallery, or sometimes hangs in the White House. And then finally, John Singleton Copley, who was also another portrait artist, he made this portrait of Mercy Otis Warren on the right. And so now, speaking of Mercy Otis Warren, for literature, she's the first person to have written a history of the Revolution. She was from New England, and she had contacts with many of the founding fathers, especially John Adams, and was able to put everything that she knew from her contact with the people that were involved into several volume set that created the entire history of the Revolution. American English will still wait to be standardized by 1806. So in the following period, we'll see Noah Webster publish his first dictionary. And then finally, for architecture, we developed this new federal style. So taken after the federal form of government that we created, and it is taking on elements of classical architecture with these columns and domes, and they're supposed to look important. They're meant to convey the importance of the building or in the work that goes inside of it. At the same time, we have the establishment of Washington, D.C. So John Adams is going to be the first president to operate out of Washington, D.C. This movement of the capital came out of the deal between James Madison and Thomas Jefferson with Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton would support the movement of the capital from New York to Washington, D.C. if Congress would pass his financial plan. And that was it for that learning objective for that topic. Now we're moving on to migration. So new learning objective, explain how and why migration and immigration to and within North America caused competition and conflict over time. The key concept says various American Indian groups repeatedly evaluated and adjusted their alliances with Europeans, other tribes in the United States, seeking to limit migration of white settlers and maintain control of tribal lands and natural resources. British alliances with American Indians contributed to tensions between the United States and Britain. So in 1790, Congress passes the Indian Intercourse Act, and that gives the federal governments the power to take control of all the dealings with Native Americans in the west of the United States. And up until this point, there are still British outposts in the Great Lakes region, and they are supplying Native Americans with weapons and supplies to continue their fight against encroachment of white settlers. Um, Whenever conflict begins to arise with white settlers going into Western lands, the federal government continues to take the sides of white settlers. And the Western Confederacy, which we talked about in the last lecture, this alliance of Native American tribes in the northwest of the United States, had been successful at limiting settlers through 1794. And then what changes is the Battle of Fallen Timbers. In the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the British essentially keep the Native Americans who are fighting the United States forces out of their forts. They don't give them shelter in order to try and avoid war with the United States. And so now the Native Americans have no other ally in the region, which is going to lead to signing of the Treaty of Grenville. All right, expanding into the frontiers. So as increasing numbers of migrants from North America and other parts of the world continue to move westward, frontier cultures that had emerged in the colonial period continued to grow, fueling social, political, and ethnic tensions. So migrants continued to come from all over the world to the United States at a chance of owning land. And then the population of the United States continued to grow naturally. From 1776 to the year 1800, the population of the United States nearly doubled from 2.5 million to just under 5. And these frontier cultures that were emerging were still seen as a continuity from the colonial period. In the colonial period, you might remember the Paxton Boys, who were the Scotch-Irish, who were living on the far western frontiers of the colonies, and they were often getting into conflicts with Native Americans in those regions. Now, in the era of the New Republic, we have these explorers are venturing west into the newly won land for the United States and trying to organize it. Daniel Boone becomes legend in his own time for the exploration that he did of Kentucky, and it builds this lore of the pioneers and the pioneer lifestyle. And really, a lot of this lore is created after his death in the early 1800s. So by the 1850s and 1860s, he continues to be a popular figure in American folklore. The painting that you see of him crossing the Cumberland Gap on the bottom right was painted about 40 years after he had died. All right, and then our last learning objective for today, explain the continuities and changes in regional attitudes about slavery as it expanded from 1754 to 1800. The key concept says the expansion of slavery in the Deep South and adjacent Western lands and rising anti-slavery sentiment began to create distinctive regional attitudes towards slavery. So let's begin with the anti-slavery sentiment. Most of the anti-slavery supporters were usually Quakers and Mennonites. The Quakers were the ones who submitted the first petition to Congress to abolish slavery. That's the 1790 anti-slavery petition, and it was penned by Benjamin Franklin. And it was urging Congress to abolish slavery altogether right now when the country is young and it can do so quickly and fast and effectively, and so that it does not grow to be a bigger problem later on. Congress takes on this petition, they debate it, and given that they didn't have a Supreme Court with powers of judicial review yet, it was really up to them as to whether or not they thought that they could make a law that pertains to slavery. So they looked at the Constitution. They saw that the Constitution said that Congress can't make any laws in regards to the international slave trade, the importation of enslaved people from abroad until the year 1807. So they took that to mean that Congress also could not make any laws in trying to limit slavery until 1807. And so sadly, their petition goes unanswered. The Congress does not do anything in favor of abolishing slavery. Now, the expansion in the early republic, the expansion of slavery in the early republic due to the new crop of cotton. So in 1793, the cotton gin is invented by Eli Whitney, and it helps separate the cotton fibers from the cotton seeds. You see an image on the right side as to what it looks like. And so you can see how the cotton fibers are getting separated, and all of the residue, all of the things that can't go into the textile mill get separated a lot easier. It exponentially speeds up the process um, of making textiles, because this very slow process of handpicking the seeds out of the cotton would take too long. So this leads Southerners to adopt cotton as the new crop of the South. The interregional slave trade grows during this time period because as enslavers in the South are looking for more enslaved labor, they look to their neighbors up north who are not using enslaved labor as often anymore. And so it transports between 500,000 to 1 million enslaved people from the northern and middle colonies or middle states down to the southern states. Now, the Southerners are also beginning to look to the Western territories for more land to cultivate, because cotton is a crop that does take a lot of nutrients from the soil. So they're looking to expand further. And as they go into new lands, new territories out west, they're also bringing the enslaved people with them, which means that they are expanding the territory in which slavery is practiced. And so that's going to become a big issue that's going to culminate into the Civil War in 1860. All right, to recap, a new national identity developed with regional differences. We saw art, literature, and architecture beginning to reflect the new culture. American Indians and white settlers repeatedly clashed over the land. American expansion west also fueled new cultures. And finally, slavery continued to be practiced, and it grew still after the cotton gin was invented. All right, that is our second to last lecture here on period 3. We have one more to go, and so I will see you when we do lecture number 22.